Hello, good people. It is Todd Shannon, data scientist, social commentator, getter of the buckets. And what are we talking about today? Today, I thought about talking about the theology of the Daily Wire. The Daily Wire is an interesting outfit because they are obviously politically conservative, and so we and a prominent voice in the political sphere, right? As far as conservatives are concerned. But actually quite a diverse group of theological views represented from the on-air talent of the Daily Wire. And the reason why this matters is because I've always believed, you've heard the phrase probably that politics is downstream of culture, which is a fancy way of saying culture determines our political views, right? It's the culture comes first and then the political comes second. Now, there's an argument that they affect each other, but that's a general kind of more prominent statement. But then I have always believed that culture is downstream of theology. Culture is downstream of religion, right? So what people believe about God affects your culture, and then the culture affects the politics. But no matter what, every political view at base, at bottom, is about theology. And people do not understand that. What you believe about God really goes down to what you think about morality and what you think about how people should govern themselves. So this is not an insignificant or unimportant topic. Now, the way this has played out is that we've seen an example in the recent past on how different theological views can affect some of the political alliances. And case in point is Candace Owens and her feud with Ben Shapiro. Now, I covered this some months ago, last year. And I think that this is a real important thing. Like, I think in part, at least, the differing theological views, Ben being an Orthodox Jew, and obviously Candace being what I would call, I'm not being judgmental here. I'm trying to be, fair to her. I would call her, she seems to me like marginally Christian, right? She seems very clearly to me to be, theologically at least, a novice at best. And so, I think that many of her takes are uninformed. I think Candace is an important voice when it comes to conservatism and blacks in particular, right? Kind of the black community, and being I think an effective tool for saying, hey, just because I'm black, I don't mean to have to drink the leftist Kool-Aid. She's been effective toward that end, and that's why I think the Daily Wire put her on board, right? But outside of that sphere, she is really out of her depths, right? And I thought it was very clear that when it came to the Palestine and Israel conflict that arose last year, that was on full display. Her limited ability to speak on topics that go outside that very limited scope was on full display. And obviously the Palestine and Hamas kind of conflict, the Palestine-Israel conflict, I should say, is not necessarily theological, but I think you can't get around the theological implications there because there are some, even though that may not necessarily be the initial or the most important driver. It is one of the most important drivers at best. So in any case, these things are important, right? Whenever you have differing theological views, in any case, what we really have is we are effectively co-belligerents against radical leftism, which at its core is an anti-God movement, if we're being honest. And Michael Knowles actually said this really well in his program the other day. I thought it was fantastic. He said, really, liberalism and leftism is basically kind of a parody of Christianity, right? It's basically white European people who have rejected the traditions of Christianity that have been pervasive in the West, and they've kind of adopted a lot of the postures in kind of a false way of Christianity, but imbued it with some sort of secular, values, which actually don't hold up. Basically, they're making moral claims that they can't really ground unless they accept the very God they're attempting to reject. So I thought it was an excellent take, right? So anyone who believes in God and believes in the traditional view of God, that God is sovereign, God is the one who determines the moral value of human beings. He determines what we ought to do and how we ought to do it, and God's say is final, anyone who holds that view is going to be a co-belligerent against radical leftism. But that doesn't mean it isn't worth exploring how some of those things can introduce potential conflicts. And also, I think, just as a general rule, that all error begets error, right? I believe this. Even if you don't really understand sometimes how a particular view of God or a particular theological view might actually impact some sort of, tangential political view down the road, eventually all the error comes back to bite you, right? So you want to get rid of as many false beliefs as you can. And so we're going to examine the potentially, I'm just saying potentially, not necessarily, but the potentially explosive mix of theological views of the Daily Wire. Now, to jump into this, I'll tell you what was really kind of the other jumping off point right here when I really thought about how I want to approach this is the recent proclamations of the Pope, and how he talked about so-called blessing gay marriage, right? Now, what I found so fascinating about this is that I went back and watched a conversation that Allie Beth Stuckey, another prominent conservative voice, female, and George Farmer, who's Candace Owens' husband, they're having a kind of a debate, kind of a more of a discussion, right? Kind of a back and forth discussion, not a formal debate, but a discussion about the merits of Catholicism versus Protestantism and the differences in how we view theological issues, right? The authority of the church and solo scriptura. They talked about a lot of things, but what was really, really interesting is that what came up about the so-called the authority of the church and the authority of the Pope and papal infallibility, which I found really interesting, that has I think a really unique overlap with political views. And there's a rare occasion where our political system can give us some insight into which view, Catholicism or Protestantism, might be a more feasible way to approach discerning biblical truth. So let's let George Farmer describe what he believes is the virtues of the papacy and the Catholicism more broadly, and then we will talk about why I think he's wrong. So here we see Allie Beth Stuckey and George Farmer. Let's listen.
And most Catholic theologians, and this is not all of them, but most Catholic theologians, I think, would argue that papal infallibility has been used in its entire existence, which is a complicated argument in and of itself, and I'm happy to break that down, but most of it has been used about 7 times, right, since Christ.
But that wasn't my question.
No, and I know, but I'm saying that because it's important.
So, by the way, just for context, Allie Beth Stuckey asked him, basically, if you're trying to say that the priests and the church have this authority because Protestants believe in sola scriptura, which is to say that the scriptures alone are our authority for morality, for ideas about God, so forth and so on. Catholics do not believe that. They believe that the church is imbued with certain authority. And it's kind of a complicated argument, but basically she's asking him, well, if the church has some authority that is not necessarily grounded in the scriptures themselves, then by what standard do you judge a priest or the Pope whenever they say something that is wrong? So that's the question.
Since the doctrine of papal infallibility was actually defined at the First Vatican Council, it's been used to...
Which was, I think, not until like the late 1800s, right?
Yeah, correct. It was in the 1860s. And it's been used twice, right, to define the Assumption of Mary and Mary's Immaculate Conception. Before that, as I said, it wasn't actually a defined doctrine, but before that it was used twice to combat the Jansean heresies of the 17th and 16th century. Before that, it was used once in the 13th century to rebut the idea of soul sleep, basically that people, when they die, they have to wait until the final judgment before they can see the beatific vision. And then before that, you're back into the first millennia of Christianity when it's defining things like the arguments against Nestorianism, Pelagianism. And as I say, that's only 7 times in a 2,000-year history. The reason that papal infallibility exists, and I would actually say that this is something where I'm going to throw the question back across to you, is that it's used to define doctrines in the negative, right? And this is something where the Pope does not just sit down and say, it's Tuesday, I would like to say that this doctrine must be used by the Church forever. It is used in extreme circumstances where the Church is divided on matters of faith and morality to define exactly what the Church's position is.
Now, I want you to keep what he just said in mind, because this is simply, this is the classic definition of, yeah, you're saying that, but in practice, that's not actually how it works. So basically, he's saying we need this centralized authority whenever the church is divided to come in and kind of settle the matter. But the thing that I'm going to show you in just a few minutes is that it doesn't matter what the Pope says. It doesn't settle the matter. So the whole supposed benefit of papal authority and papal infallibility is negated by the fact that you can say whatever you want to say. It doesn't mean that people are going to accept it, and it doesn't actually create the sort of unity that he is proclaiming that it does. But let's let him continue.
Right. So in the event, for example, let's take the debates of the first millennia of Nestorianism. Huge Christological issue, literally divides the church. The Eastern Nestorian church, which no longer exists, was wiped out by the rise of Islam. The Nestorian church went after the teachings of Nestorius, and the Western church became non-Nestorian. The church had to define what the dual natures of Christ, like how the person of Christ and the 2 natures of Christ became one. And this is where you then get Theotokos, the Mother of God, etc., which obviously relates to Mary. So you get this conflict where the church needs to issue a definitive statement. And that is why the Pope is granted this authority in the same way that Christ, and of course this comes back to the scriptural basis for this, where Christ says, you are Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church. The keys of heaven will be granted to you. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, etc., etc. That authority is used very infrequently as a means to define church doctrine. The flip side of this being, and this is where I'm going to throw the question back to you, if you have no central authority, right, which, for example, the Anglican Church has a central authority, has the Archbishop of Canterbury in theory, right, the primacy of the Anglican Church, but it has no infallible seat. As a result, the church is in total collapse. Now, there's a lot of reasons that it's in total collapse, but one of the reasons is that nobody can define what church doctrine is infallibly, right? Because there is no central teaching authority from which the church itself can draw.
All right, so you hear that argument here. Now, this is the thing that is so interesting and intriguing about that, is that, there again, the central claim is that the Pope coming in and saying, thus saith the Lord, this is what the official church position will be. That somehow that basically imbues the church with some sort of stability and staying power is only true in theory. Because what I want to show you here is an interesting development here, right? This is so interesting. This is back in 2021. Now, in light of the fact, once again, that now the Pope is offering blessings to gay couples. So this is kind of old news. This is an old article. Now the Pope is saying it's okay to bless, even though what I've heard some Catholic apologists say is that, well, he's not really saying that he's endorsing gay relationships. He's just saying maybe gay people can come and give. I don't really understand the distinction. I think it's a convoluted mess. And really, I think it's intentionally deceitful, to be quite frank. I think it's, the Pope doing Pope things, paying his homage to the leftist narrative because he is a leftist, quite frankly. So I don't know what the real distinction is. But look at this. German priests defy Vatican to bless gay couples. Says the Love Win movement emerged from the Catholic Church, said in March that God, quote, cannot bless sin. The Love Win movement emerged after the Catholic Church said in March that God, quote, cannot bless sin. Of course not. Couples who take part should receive the blessing that God wants to give them without any secrecy, the group wrote earlier. Pope Francis has previously said he believes same-sex couples should be allowed to have civil unions. Last year, he told a documentary that these couples have a right to be in a family. However, he has also approved the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith's stance that the Catholic Church does not have the power to bless same-sex unions. In the Catholic Church, a blessing is given by a priest or other minister in the name of the church. So, we could go on reading, but the main point that I want to underscore is that here you have a group of priests clearly saying, we don't think the church is getting it right. We don't think they get it right. Furthermore, what ended up actually happening was the Pope came over to their side as of recently, the last few weeks or so, maybe about a month or so ago. I can't remember how long ago it was. But the Pope actually came out. Now he is saying, oh, yeah, we can bless them. There again, his convoluted and confusing explanation. I think intentionally so. So the question is the Pope speaking infallibly with respect to this? Right? Now, George and other Catholic apologists are going to say, well, no, in this particular time, he's not speaking infallibly. But then this becomes like a whole thing, right? Which is if the Pope is his own authority, right? So here's my thing. If they don't think he's speaking infallibly, but then the Pope says he is, then who settles that method? Who settles that dispute? And the point that I really wanted to underscore is that in practice, this supposedly unifying presence of a central authority on matters of doctrine doesn't really work, right? But I want to kind of pivot from that to something actually a lot more, I think, more meaningful, and I think we can understand, I think, as Americans at least, why it might be the case. Because we live in a country that we are a federalist society, which is to say we have a federal constitution, right? But then we also have the states who have still some level of independence and sovereignty. And what we have is, what the effect of it is that we have decentralized authority, right? So let's just point this back out. We have decentralized authority, and then we have centralized authority. So, for example, a country that doesn't have individual states, but just has a federal government, is centralized. And the question is, what is the advantage? What is the value of a decentralized system of authority, right? What happens when you, and it goes even further, right? Because even at the state level, you have also local governments. You have cities and municipalities and counties and all of these things, right? So we always talk about the virtue of local autonomy and decentralized authority. What's the advantage of that? Well, the advantage of that is, first of all, if you have a centralized government, right? If you have a centralized authority and there's something corrupted or wrong about that centralized authority, then the entire entity now becomes compromised. But when you have decentralized authority, then whenever, it doesn't matter what part of that entity is corrupted, because it is decentralized, the entire entity is not at jeopardy. Interestingly enough, the Bible is this way. The Bible is a decentralized source of truth. And by that, I mean this. The whole Bible, obviously, is our authority about matters of doctrine and faith. But there's no particular part of the Bible that if you removed it, that would basically, that where all of the major and important doctrines of the church couldn't be reconstructed from other places in the Bible. In other words, the Bible is resilient against hostile jamming. If you were to remove any one book in the Bible, most of any particular principle or teaching that we consider important and essential to the faith can be derived from all of the other books. That's pretty much true for any of the major doctrines. Now, we would lose some detail, obviously, or then that book wouldn't be necessary. It would be redundant if we wouldn't lose anything at all. So I'm not saying we don't lose anything. What I'm saying is the major important doctrines would not be lost because all of the important doctrines, up to and including the deity of Christ, the Trinity, the giving of the Holy Spirit, substitutionary atonement, grace of God, all of those things, even the deity of Christ, maybe I already said that, many things that we consider to be central. Those truths are not just all in one place. So it's decentralized. Okay, so there's that. Also, humanity itself is decentralized. It's interesting, right? If you think about it, I did this, and I went through this with a small group that I have, and we talked about how God kind of created the community of humanity to function in a decentralized way, where you have the family, right? You have the man and the woman. They form a family unit, and the husband being the head of the family. But then those families are the basic building blocks of communities, and those communities are the basic building blocks of nations, and nations are basic building blocks of the world, right? And so the nations really are a gift of God. When you think about even going back to the Tower of Babel, why did God disperse the people? Why did God force them apart? He said, well, if they're all one, nothing will be able to stop them. But because if not only would nothing be able to stop them, but I think what was really in the purview, and I think this can be inferred, even though it's not explicitly mentioned in Genesis when it talks about the Tower of Babel, the inference is if they're all one and they are corrupted and divided and united against my will, then all of them are in serious trouble. So God decentralizes their language, and he makes it so they have to disperse, so that maybe certain people groups went in certain directions and had more sin and more a stronger commitment to an anti-God and a demonic agenda, but that wouldn't permeate the entire human community or the entire human race. So we see that decentralization in the Tower of Babel. We see the decentralization with even God given authority ultimately at the family level. So you have the family level. So you have all of these levels, kind of like what we see in our human government here in the United States, our decentralized government. And this is the interesting overlap that I find given Daily Wire's political ideas, but the fact that most of the pundits there are Catholic and they don't believe in decentralized spiritual authority. The question is, if God intended for centralized authority such as they're trying to establish in the Catholic Church, if he intended for that to be the way that the church functioned, then why is everything that we see in God's design for both the human family and communities and nations, the decentralization of the truth in the Bible, all of these things, why wouldn't that also be good for the church? Why wouldn't it be good for the church to have decentralized authority, which is effectively what the Protestant church is? It's really a bunch of people, just like if you think about our federalist system, once again, Why is it we got California, which is a cesspool of wokeness. They are way out there doing their own thing. And if you don't like what they're doing, you can go to Texas and you can escape the nonsense. And it's almost like going to a different country, right? It is so different culturally and politically when you move from California to Texas or from New York to Florida. It's important that we have, just think about if every state in the United States had to function like California. Could you imagine? Now, we're all under the same constitution, but the Catholic system would basically be of the opinion that we should function not as a federalist system, but as a centralized government. We would say everybody's got to do the same thing. States have no autonomy. They have no interpretive freedom with respect to how they want to implement the principles of the Constitution. Again, which is what Protestantism is. It's where every state has effectively their own conscience and take on the Constitution's ultimate authority. That's the Protestant church. So I find it interesting, once again, that we see this decentralization both in the Bible, we see it in human communities, we see it all throughout God's design, but yet the Catholic Church is saying, no, in this case, we want to go straight up to this one guy who routinely, and this is the final point, when the Pope is coming out and saying, yeah, we can bless same-sex marriage, I mean, every Catholic, every conservative Catholic is cringing, right? Because now the cognitive dissonance is seeping in. And so I find that really interesting. So I'm going to do more content like this because I'm going to revisit Ben Shapiro's Judaism here shortly also. And really, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Catholicism, because once again, these things can come up and they can cause a rift when we're trying to really move and advance against the left. I think we have to be careful not to let that stuff take us over. We have to be careful not to let that divide us. So we need to be aware of these differences, but mark my words, they're coming, right? The Candace Owens, Ben Shapiro thing, it showed you that it's coming. And so we got to be prepared, and we got to understand when these divisions come up, what are the reasons why the other side rejects certain things. I do want to mention lastly, George Farmer mentioned that since the papal infallibility became an official doctrine of the Catholic Church back in the 1800s, it's only been used twice supposedly, both of them dealing with Mary, and the assumption of Mary was one that he said, which is interesting because it says that Mary was taken up. Basically, she didn't die. Effectively, she was almost like just assumed into heaven. I'm gonna link why the Catholic Church is so bent on this centralized authority, and especially when it comes to Mary and different doctrines. It's going to be an interesting ride. So I'm curious to know what your thoughts are. This is a little bit longer and deeper discussion. I think the different doctrinal positions of the Daily Wire and the political implications there are interesting, and I'm curious to know what your thoughts are. Why don't you leave me a comment, a like, please share and subscribe. And until next time, friends, God bless you.